Well, thank you for joining us for this second event in a series of webinars on reimagining the post-COVID world. These webinars are organized by the Institute for the Future of Knowledge at the University of Johannesburg in partnership with the Library and Information Centre. We're very grateful to them for the fantastic support they've been providing in this novel context in which we find ourselves. I also want in particular to thank our research coordinator at the Institute, Mr. Anthony Casaboni, and the events coordinator at the library, Ms. Renika Pandey. Please note that this is a live event and that audio, video and chat functions are recorded. Audience microphones and cameras are off. You're welcome to pose questions to our panelists using the chat function, bearing in mind we may not be able to get to all the questions, and again, that everyone can see your questions. So this is part of a larger project that is initiated by the Vice-Chancellor's Office and that seeks to look past the current turmoil and ask what comes next. And it's my great pleasure to invite the Vice-Chancellor, Professor Chilitsi Mwawala, to welcome and to open this event.
Today is an exciting time for me. This is the second engagement on the post-COVID. Why is the post-COVID important? It is because if we do not plan for the future, then the future is actually going to defeat us. We need to understand what this new reality has brought us and how we're going to navigate around it so that we can at least create a better life for human beings. We have invited excellent speakers, and I'm not going to speak about all the speakers that have already spoken and the speakers that are going to speak today. But these are distinguished people coming from a diverse array of backgrounds and bringing that expertise and experience into how can we understand COVID-19 and how do we plan for the future post-COVID-19. We might not be post-COVID-19. It might be that we will not be able to find a vaccine for COVID-19. And therefore, this world of self-isolation and social distancing is probably going to become a reality. This will necessarily require us to start imagining how do our workplaces look like? How do we deal with movement of people from one part of the country to another? How do the visa regime that allow people to move from one country to another look like? I welcome all of you to come and engage on these important issues so that we can craft a better future. Thank you very much.
So tonight we're going to be talking about COVID-19 and the emerging world order. So the background here is thinking about really the last couple of decades and how the world order has been changing. In 2001, of course, there was a significant terrorist attack on the World Trade Center in America. And in 2008, America was the epicenter of a global financial crisis. Both events significantly dented what had since the end of the Cold War been a unipolar global power structure. There'd been one main player, which had been America as the uncontested economic and political global leader. Terrorism has undermined America's image, its soft power, and the financial crisis exposed some economic vulnerabilities. China, on the other hand, has been growing very steadily for several decades. In economic terms, I think its military spend is still around a third of America's, but its economy may well overtake America's someday. The question, of course, would be when and if that's going to happen. And the rest of the world, including Africa, has been coming to terms with navigating relations between two major powers, which are clearly strongly mutually dependent, but on occasions don't see 100% eye to eye. So that's how it all looked prior to the emergence of COVID-19. The question, of course, now is whether that has changed things. China's economy rebounded better from previous economic shocks. Is that going to be the case this time? Will the spheres of soft power and of influence alter? And outside of that bipolar power order, outside of looking at just China and America, are we going to see other players emerging? Are we going to see regions that have been less affected by COVID-19 doing well? And in this context, of course, Africa comes to mind significantly. On the other hand, we might see such regions doing worse because they may be less resistant to economic shocks. There's also questions about whether larger forces are going to emerge. Are we going to see more cooperation between nations, or are we going to see more protectionism? You know, you might think a global pandemic causes people to cooperate and share in their humanness. But at the same time, borders are being closed and there are quarantines, travel is being restricted. This might lead to a process of deglobalization, more distance between cultures, as well as reflecting the physical distances that exist between countries in a way that before that was perhaps declining as people traveled more and more. What does it all mean for the EU? What does it mean for migration? Presumably much less migration. That's a source of international tension, as well as a source of sharing of cultures. What does it mean for the BRICS powers? And what does it mean for the older IBSA organization, India, Brazil, and South Africa, that is part of the BRICS group? So these are the things we are going to be thinking about tonight. And I am very pleased to have with me, first of all, Dr. David Masondo. It's a great pleasure and an honor to have you with us. Dr. David Masondo is the Deputy Finance Minister for South Africa. And we're very grateful to him for taking time out of that extremely challenging role to talk to us tonight. He's passionate about education and he lectures at various places, including the University of Witwatersrand. He's also been connected to UJ. And we are delighted to have him with us as we talk about the political economy in the new world post-COVID-19. Dr. Masondo, very broadly, can we start by I want to start by asking you about South Africa, having just given a spiel about the whole world. Very broadly, what do you think South Africa is going to look like in the future? Say, 1 year, 5 years from now, how do you think this is going to change? I mean, that was a difficult question before COVID-19. How do you think the current situation is going to change it?
Thanks, Alex, and good afternoon to everyone. From the health perspective, I think our health consciousness is very high now. We are very hygienic. So I see that increasing. And I think the demand on health infrastructure, investment in health, I see that increasing. But economically, it's quite hard at the moment to tell how the economy is going to look like. There's a lot of forecasting going on, modeling going on, but everyone agrees that if we continue, I mean, obviously the impact of COVID is going to have a huge impact insofar as our economy is concerned. For South Africa, it is projected that we're going to have 6% negative economic growth, and that has huge consequences in terms of employment. Currently, there are companies that are filing for business rescue, meaning that they're getting bankrupt. Therefore, a lot of people are going to be retrenched, and the ability of government to generate revenue is going to be seriously affected. But we are doing serious modeling, forecasting, but there's no doubt that we are going to have a huge economic downturn. Some people are predicting that it is going to be greater than the Great Depression of the 1930s. But this is a shock, and a shock does not have to lead to a depression. The shock, 1929 stock crash, did not have to lead to a Great Depression. It depends on what we do.
That's very interesting. I mean, can I ask you a little about that? What do you think what actions do you think at the time did give rise to that? And, do you think they're avoidable from the South African perspective?
I think if we pay attention to putting a clear economic recovery plan to grow our economy, to focus on infrastructure, we should be able to avoid Great Depression, but it also depends on what the world does, because this crisis is not just a South African crisis, it is a global crisis.
Yes, and clearly what happens to South Africa depends a lot on what happens in other parts of the world. I wanted to ask a little bit about the debt crisis here. So South Africa has a debt crisis, and what are the options that South Africa has for moving past it? Is there anything? Do you see a sort of glimmer or a game changer that the country could put into place here?
Yes, Alex. I think the point about debt, I think it's important to put it in global context, because again, the South African debt crisis is part of the world trend, which also has to do with the fact that globally, the economy has not been doing well. Because if the economy is not doing well, your ability to generate revenue is also diminished as the state. And if you look between 1950s and 1970s, early 70s, late 60s, there was a huge economic growth. The world economy was growing at around 4%. And that set very good conditions for high employment, for sustenance of the welfare state, because the tax revenue was quite solid. But from the 70s, the economic growth has been very low. And as a result, states have not been doing very well. And this debt is not just the government debt, but it's also household debts. Companies have been in debt. And to solve that debt, which is related to the declining profitability of different companies, low economic growth, the response has been borrowing after borrowing. Household debt has basically grown significantly from the 70s. Companies' debt has been growing, government debt has been growing. And it's not by accident that we had the global economic crisis, the financial crisis in 2008. It was a reflection of the serious debt that has been growing. In South Africa, our debt is very huge, as you clearly indicated. It's 3-point-something trillion, and we pay the interest payment to service that debt is around 230 billion. So a lot of money that we should be using to provide education, health, is being shifted to pay the interest. So the debt situation is a serious one. There are a couple of options. One option is to reprioritize, cut the expenditure. But in this current context, it is going to be quite a challenge, because we do need to stimulate the economy. We need to inject a lot of money into the economy in order for us to stimulate it. But we also need to grow the economy. And to grow the economy, we've got to undertake a lot of unconventional interventions in the economy, focusing on the structural reforms, focusing on infrastructure. So for me, to deal with the issue of the debt on a sustainable level, we can't just rely on borrowing. We've got to grow the economy, because it's through the growing of the economy that we'll be able to generate sufficient revenue and generate employment.
Thank you. I'm going to move on in a second, because our time will run out. I just want to ask you, though, first, going back now to the world order, what will the new world order look like, do you think? Will COVID-19 make a difference to the world order? And do you think South Africa's prospects within that new world order are any different after what's happening at the moment to what they were before?
I think we're very worried about the rise of economic nationalism. And it was already taking place even before this COVID-19. You've seen Brexit, the trade wars between China and the US. Because if there's trade wars, there's trade barriers that are going to be erected by the global north, our ability to export whatever we can produce and manufacture here in South Africa is going to be badly affected, and therefore we are very worried about the possibilities of economic nationalism, particularly in the global north.
Okay, thank you very much. So I'm going to move along now to our next speaker, who is Mr. Grant Harris. Mr. Harris was the advisor to Obama for Africa-related matters. I think that is he has a longer title than that, but that is the simplest way to put it. He is the CEO of Harris Africa Partners, and he is here kindly at an hour that may not be entirely convenient for him because he's in America, but it's very good of you to join us, Mr. Harris. And can we start more or less where we just left off there with the Deputy Finance Minister? Can I ask you about how you would characterize the position of the United States in today's world? And perhaps you can also talk to us a bit about the concerns about protectionism that we heard just there.
Thank you for having me and inviting me to participate in this discussion. And I appreciated the minister's points. This is a very interesting moment in history for a lot of the reasons that you alluded to and the reasons that have come up so far. But I think going off of the issue of what will the world order look like emerging from coronavirus and what may change, I think there's still a lot that is unknown. Speaking as an American, right now, it's a really interesting time in American history, and there's a lot of political tumult happening in my country. And part of what is going to really determine what the world order looks like coming out of this disease is which world leaders and which countries really step up and show leadership and show a path to bring other countries together and combat this. As the minister said, as everyone understands, this pandemic won't end and won't be resolved until it's resolved by all and until it stops with its economic and its health impacts and fallout across the world. No one country can tackle this alone. There have been a lot of missteps, I think, by a lot of leaders, including on the US side, including on the Chinese side. And so it's too early, I think, to write the story of what comes out of this. But I do think the things to look for are who will be leading and how.
So do you think that COVID-19 will, I mean, just going back to what I was saying at the start, do you think it's going to have a negative impact on from the perspective of US global influence? I mean, it may be that a rebalancing of global power is not a bad thing for the world, but do you think it will reduce the impact of the United States, the power, to put it bluntly, that the United States wields globally?
I think that it can have an effect on US power, absolutely. But I think the bigger issue facing the United States right now is the presidency of Donald Trump. And I think under his presidency, there's been a lot of questions about the moral authority and the global leadership role of the United States. And that was manifested in the US response to coronavirus. It was manifested in how the government responded. And you can contrast it as well to previous instances of US leadership. I had the privilege of serving in the White House from 2011 to 2015 as President Obama's senior advisor on Africa, which included the Ebola crisis. And I saw him firsthand assemble technocratic expertise, work with world leaders, and help combat this disease. And though it wasn't a pandemic to the degree of what we're facing with coronavirus, the lessons of leadership and how the US helped like-minded states rally to combat a disease showed a lot of lessons that unfortunately were unlearned in the intervening period. And I think that as I go back to the world order and what's going to happen, I think countries are asking, where can they look for a partnership? Who will be leading? Who will be an inspiring example? And I think right now, the story is quite muddied. I think on the Chinese side, it could have been handled much better in terms of publicizing what was going on, not stifling information or doctors' reports about the disease. The reports came out as early as November 2019 in Wuhan that there was such a disease, and there were serious missteps along the way. On the US side, the response was bungled, and it should have been much more proactive and earlier and collaborative. And I think that unfortunately we're seeing that as bad as this is, some lives and some economic fallout could have been prevented, in my opinion, by greater leadership by world powers.
Yeah, just to follow that a touch. I mean, one interesting thing was the withdrawing of support for the World Health Organization by America, which obviously funded about 60% of the World Health Organization's budget. I mean, that is an interesting step in the sense that it actually means that the World Health Organization then needs more money, and of course, China has to some extent stepped into that role. I mean, it's an interesting move in the sense, in terms of a sort of global political power play, because it's almost an active withdrawal from the global stage. Do you feel that is what the nation is doing to some extent now under the current leadership? Which I take your point that it is very much to some extent the current president's vision.
I think that as you were saying, it's impossible to disassociate what's happening now and the U.S. Actions on the world stage with who our current president is. And I don't think that pulling out of the World Health Organization, as they've threatened to do, or reducing funding would be the signature move that would forever determine what U.S. engagement worldwide would look like. But I think it's folly. I think it's a terrible move during a global pandemic to threaten that. And I think that if there are legitimate concerns about how an organization has handled it, you continue to fight the pandemic, and then you figure out how best to raise those concerns and try to institute reforms. So I think there's an element of political theater going on, which suits the Trump administration's desire to have anyone else to blame about what's happening in the United States. Because the United States should not be facing death rates as they are right now. It's not, it doesn't speak well of the leadership at the moment. President Trump has a view of the world. It includes far less international engagement and global collaboration than past US presidents have had. It's important, though, particularly for an international audience, to keep in mind we all have different presidents at different times. We all have different leaders at different times. And so we need to consider also the values of a country, the people, the cultural issues of a country, the longstanding investments that a country have made. And we need to contextualize what's happening with one particular individual, as important as that individual and administration may be. But also when we think about America's role in the world, that won't be decided solely by a 4-year term of office or by one president. That will be an important element in how the US is seen, but there are many other factors at stake.
That sounds to me like a very diplomatic way of saying, please ignore our president and think about America itself and not the actual president. Can I ask you, going on from that, I mean, some people have talked about a sort of a potential Cold War emerging between China and the United States, and perhaps that does connect with what you just said. I mean, how would you characterize relations between the two nations, which in some senses are competitors, but in other senses very much need each other? And how do you think that the US, from its side, should handle that relationship?
Your point is a great one in that there's a lot of need for collaboration, even as there is a sense of competition in many ways as well. And I think as many people throw around the term Cold War or look past to that historical situation between the US and the Soviet Union, I find it less apropos when we think about the economic interdependence between the US and Chinese economies and the high levels of trade, how global supply chains work, the amount of US Treasury bills that the Chinese government holds as well. There are a lot of linkages that I think demand cooperation and demand thinking about how one's fate affects the other. At the same time, there is an air of competition too. There are two different worldviews. There's a different set of values. And the United States, and this keys off of your comment as well about this current administration versus what it is over time in terms of American history. U.S. is constantly striving to be a more perfect union, as is in the preamble of our Constitution. And like any country, there are missteps along the way, but I think the values that characterize the United States are more of openness and transparency, of democracy, of freedom, of civil liberty. China has a different model, both economically, though increasingly it's more capitalistic in nature, but it has a much different governance model and approach to its citizens. And so that creates real differences of view in the global order as well. So my advice to the US government would be to try to find those areas of collaboration and cooperation and pursue them while also staying true to US values.
Thank you. Well, on that note, let me now move on to our third panelist, who is Professor Dong Wang. Professor Wang is the Executive Director of the Institute for Global Cooperation and Understanding at Peking University. It is a great honor to have him with us, not least because where he is, I believe it is now 10:30 p.m. in the evening. So he is very much doing this in his own time. And we're extremely grateful for that. Having somebody on the line from America and from China at the same time does present timetabling challenges. And we're very grateful, Professor Wang. So Professor Wang, can I start by just asking you then, from your perspective, much as I was asking Mr. Harris, do you think that COVID-19 is going to affect the political influence, the global influence of China?
Thank you, Dr. Broadbent. First of all, I'd like to thank you for your institute and you for inviting me to join this very important discussion. I think this is a crucial time for us to get together to discuss about the emerging world order in the post-COVID-19 world. And regarding to your first question, I think actually, if you may, I actually would like to look at the issue from a sort of different way. I think this is this unprecedented crisis brought by the COVID-19 pandemic really, I think it's not a kind of zero-sum sort of game. It's like you win, I lose, or I win, you lose kind of scenario. So indeed, I think the COVID-19 pandemic remind us actually again that everyone, every country, every member of the international community, we actually rise and fall together. So unless everyone, every country, unless we work together and defeat this pandemic together, no one will emerge out of this pandemic as a winner. So there's only way going forward, which is that we work together, try to find a global concerted response to the pandemic, and that's the only way we can emerge stronger and more resilient.
Can I follow that up a little? So how do you see that cooperation working? I mean, because in my preamble, I sort of talked a little bit about protectionism, and Mr. Harris was also talking about that, and so is Dr. Masondo. There's the fear that nations will solidify their borders, and that having closed them down, they won't open them up again as fully as they were. I mean, that might be one way in which nations could act differently to promote that kind of cooperation. Are there any other things that you have in mind to prevent it from becoming a zero-sum game or even a negative-sum game?
Right. I think first of all, I would also like to say I share with Mr. Harris' observation. I think economic nationalism certainly is something threatening the possibility of forging and concerted global response. And another thing I think very important, which is sort of at a philosophical level, I think we have to restore a healthy balance between science and politics. So if the healthy balance between science and politics is broken, this is actually what is happening now. You've got stigmatization of the pandemic. You've got a scapegoating going on. You've got the marginalization of the public health professionals. in shaping the responses to the pandemic, both at the local and global levels. So we really have to, I think, to let the scientists, let the public health professionals to take the lead in shaping an effective response to the pandemic. I think that's, from what I see, where the key. And every country has to work together toward their goal.
Okay. Okay. So the sense of sort of uniting behind a sort of a common framework of scientific recommendation, which can unify.
Right. Indeed, you know, I would like to just add another very quick sort of observation. I think, you know, I think this fight against pandemic really is not about, although I share, you know, I appreciate Mr. Harris, his observation a moment ago. I would say this fight against the COVID-19 pandemics is really not about what kind of political value system or, you know, political system you are in. It's really about science, right? Whether or not you are following the recommendations from scientists and the public health professionals. For all the countries, I think they actually do well in this battle are the ones who actually the ones who have achieved that. So I think the key is really to depoliticize this our battle, our fight against the pandemic. So one of the key obstacles to forging a global concerted response is the hyper-politicization process now is going on. And I think this is extremely harmful. We should try to find a way to stop that.
Well, this may partly provide an answer to the next question I was going to ask you, which is whether, to what extent China is a revisionist power, is a power that wants a different world order. I mean, obviously, any emerging and growing power will naturally need a world order that accommodates them. But you know, is it a power that wants a totally different world order, or is it more of a sort of don't rock the boat sort of non-aggressive sort of approach? What's your sense of how Chinese foreign policy works in that regard?
Sure. I think the short answer is that China is absolutely not a revisionist power. And in fact, I would argue that China is among one of the staunchest defender of the existing international order, which I think is anchored on the United Nations and many other multilateral international institutions. So you know, there are many, I think, areas we can look into. Just very quickly, I can you know, mention that China is actually among the largest contributor to the United Nations peacekeeping operations. Since China first joined the UN peacekeeping operations back in the early 1990s, nowadays China has altogether contributed more than 41,000 soldiers to that cause. And indeed, at any given time, while we are talking, China would have over 2,500 Peace Corps soldiers deployed all across globe from Syria to Darfur. And indeed, I think over the years, 17 men and women from the Peace Corps of Chinese peacekeeping corps have sacrificed their lives for safeguarding, I think, safeguarding the global peace and security. So this is just one example of how what China is doing is trying to defend the current order. But that being said, I would also add that China is also reform-oriented because China firmly believes that the voices from developing countries need to be more fairly represented in the current international system. And that's actually precisely the reason why, right, China and South Africa, we together, two of us, and also Russia, Brazil, India, five of us came together and formed this BRICS grouping. And what we are trying to do is that we want to bring the voices of emerging countries to be more heard on the world stage. So So, I don't know if you call the BRICS revisionist. If you call it revisionist, then then both South Africa and China are revisionist powers. But simply, I don't think so. So I think that probably will be the way I will characterize China's role toward international order.
Thank you for that. And let me finish then by posing the same question that I asked to Mr. Harris about whether we are witnessing a Cold War between America and China.
Well, I know that many people, myself included, actually were worried that a new Cold War is sort of gonna, is gonna coming in the years to come. But I think from a Chinese perspective, we have zero interest in getting into another Cold War with the United States. But the problem for now is that we have a bunch of folks in the United States, the so-called super hawks. They get very excited about talking about a new Cold War against China. So I think that's something. I think it's a bit of a challenge. I think facing us how to deal with that. And I think there are a number of things we can do. One is that really have to remove the veil of ideological prejudices and self-righteousness and fear, and to acknowledge that the diversities in different the political system or developed models each country pursues. Actually, this is something legitimate, and the Chinese perspective is always that we don't think China's. Of course, we would be happy to share our experiences with many other members of the international community, but we never insist that our model or our system is the best one, and everyone else has to learn from us. That's not the Chinese way. So acknowledging the diversity in the pathway toward achieving modernity is a very important, I think, precondition for us to understand why a new Cold War is unnecessary, why the kind of achievement that China has made over the years really does not represent a threat to the United States. So I think that's another perspective, very important, very key. I think very much for us to bring in to understand this issue, and also finally, I think together, I think we have to China. We have to really the United States and China, and also I think the whole international community. We have to really come together. We have to overcome, parochial knowledge, and also political selfishness is other things that absolutely has to be abandoned. And we have to have science to take the lead in this global battle, and we have to defeat this pandemic together. And going forward, I think it is also very important for us to have conceptualized, I think, power, as I just said, not only in a non-zero sum perspective, but also in positive sum. I think the global fight against the pandemic is perfect example. The only, unless all countries, all players, all countries, we join hands together, put our powers, resources, capabilities together, we're not gonna defeat this this disease. So I think that's. I also the last point I want to make that is that I think it's this fight against pandemics really, as I just said, it's not about ideology. It is not about different political values, and also I think we have to try to find the ways, the common ground between I think the United States and China. And I would argue that they are also, despite the some differences in our values, in our political system, but they are also the common values. I think that China, the United States, and the international community we share together. So I think that positive sum perspective is crucial, and also. The last degree, removing this veil of ideological prejudices and self-righteousness is also key to remind us that I want to say that every sober-minded. Last thing I want to say is that every member, sober-minded, I think members. Of the international community, we share this responsibility. We have to together, say to those who wanted to launch a new Cold War, we should say to them, stop, stop, stop pushing us, the whole world, off the cliff. And I also firmly believe that there are many more people in the world share this view.
Thank you. Well, that's excellent. That's very interesting. I'm going to move on now to Dr. Teller, who is a senior researcher at the Institute for the Future of Knowledge. So he is a local hero. Dr. Teller, can I ask you then, how would you characterize the post-COVID-19 emerging world order, and how does it differ from the world order that was emerging before COVID-19?
Oh, thank you, Prof, for having me. I think the pandemic will not significantly distort the existing power relations that we have. I think it will only reinforce the decline of United States-led globalization and the rise of China-led globalization. Many commentators often blame Donald Trump for the United States' current global position. But the reality is that the United States has been hit by 3 major crises in the last 2 decades. The backlash resulting from the United States-led war on terrorism, the 2007-2008 financial crisis, and now COVID-19. In my view, this crisis have significantly punctured America's global image, economic strength, and disaster management capacity, respectively. And a number of people would agree with me that China has significantly benefited from this, seen in the emergence of China as a great power. I think it's important to also highlight that beyond the geopolitical context between the United States and China, there is an important dimension to their relations, which is the fact that these countries cooperate on a number of levels. The most important for me is the fact that China is the workshop of the world, and it relies heavily on American markets for its manufactured goods and services. On the other hand, the United States is highly indebted to China. In terms of the post-COVID-19 relations between these 2 countries, I think there are 2 possibilities. The first one is a geopolitical contest between these 2 powers, and the second one is an intensive cooperation. So in my view, there will be a geopolitical contest if the United States sees the need to reinforce its global primacy, and China sees the need to distort the status quo. On the other hand, there could be cooperation if both countries realize the importance of coming together to promote economic globalization and tackle global challenges.
Okay. I want to ask about Africa's position in the world order. How much as I asked Dr. Masondo at the outset, is there a way for Africa or nations within Africa to to capitalize, so to speak, on the disruption, if one wants to put it in those terms. A sort of a more polite way to put it is build back better. There are various terms for the idea that one can use the opportunity arising from the current situation to improve the lot of developing nations. What do you see Africa as having opportunities in that regard?
I would like to state at the outset that both China and the United States are not superpowers. In the immediate period after the Cold War, the United States emerged as the lone superpower following the disintegration of the USSR. But following the US war on terrorism and the global financial crisis, the United States stepped down as a superpower to a great power, and China stepped up from its position as a middle power to a great power. So in this context, I think it's important for Africa to begin to imagine a world without superpowers, a world with a number of great powers and middle powers. And in this context, it is important for Africa to begin to establish and maintain relations with other key actors such as Brazil, India, Turkey, Iran, Germany, and Saudi Arabia. I also foresee a retreat from globalization, and I think it will be important for Africa to use this medium to strengthen regional integration. And the efforts of key regional organizations such as ECOWAS, African Union, and SADC will be critical in this regard. And lastly, I think sub-regional actors such as Nigeria, South Africa, Kenya, and Egypt need to mobilize their sub-regions and work closely together at the continental level to genuinely find African solutions to African challenges.
Well, thank you. We've had a number of questions come in, and I think I'm now going to open this up to the panel. One of the questions that has come in relates actually to something that was said last week. We had the Swedish scientist, Professor Johan Giesecke on, and we had Dr. Joyce Banda, former president of Malawi. And one of the things that came up was Professor Giesecke said that he did not think that lockdowns would work, would be appropriate in countries like the democracies, in effect. That one could do it in a system like the Chinese system, whereas it would not be acceptable, but based on the expectations of citizens, really, in Western countries. I wanted to come back to this question of whether the response is really just dictated by the science, or to what extent political values come into play, which of course can cut both ways. It may mean it's not a righteous question, so to speak. It may be that this demonstrates an advantage of certain kinds of ways of running a country. But can I open that question to the panel? What do you think of the idea then that more stringent measures for dealing with disease, or indeed, I suppose, any other disaster, are going to be more difficult to take or less likely to be accepted in a democratic system?
That also depends on how our conception of human behavior, what we think of a human being. Because regulations, they don't entirely work. People always have a way of undermining them. And therefore, we do need to really, really rely on the citizens to take their own action, and without romanticizing human behavior and always thinking that human beings will always act in the interest of everyone. But I think we do need to largely rely on the human being. But if I may come back to some of the issues that were raised about the emerging world order, I think I sort of disagree with some of the points about like there will be a single hegemon power that is going to, in a way, shape the post-COVID world order. I think, for instance, the United States has lost its manufacturing competitiveness, and it's not by accident that the president, and I'm taking off my ministry deputy minister hat, sorry. What I'm gonna say here doesn't represent government view. It's just my own view, so that I don't cause a diplomatic crisis. I don't think, I mean, the US has lost its hegemonic power. If you look at their manufacturing capability, it's gone. It's not by accident that President Donald Trump says, buy America, high America, closing the imports, because a lot of manufacturing companies in the US, they've lost their manufacturing competitiveness. Militarily, I think it was Doctor was basically indicating how they've lost wars in Afghanistan. Maybe the dollar is still a dominant currency, but you've seen regional currencies such as the euro. So I do not think what we are likely to see, in my view, it's regional leaders in different, I mean, for instance, China might be hegemon around Asia, Germany, possible hegemon in Europe, and it has been in a while. And by hegemon here, I mean a country that is leading, setting rules which are acceptable by member countries, because those member countries benefit out of the arrangement. Now, coming to Africa, I think with the rise of economic nationalism, there's a huge opportunity for us in Africa to piggyback, to work on this Africa continental free trade, which is trying to establish a common African market. But for it to succeed, we also need a common currency, because if you are to do trade, it will be important for us to have a common currency, because when trading takes place using multiple currencies, it entails exchange rate risks, because if the South African currency is stronger, it's going to be very difficult to export things into Africa. So the idea about integration, which I agree with, it must also entail the idea of common currency, because the African continental free trade provides us with a great basis to basically respond against this regionalization, economic nationalism, because Africa have got very small nation states. We do need to optimize, piggyback on build on our population. But as long as we continue with these boundaries, which are making it very difficult for us to exchange. I mean, for instance, if you are to trade with another country, for you to buy something, you've got to go to the Forex market in order to exchange the currencies, and there's transaction costs there. So the common currency could potentially play a key role in the post-COVID situation. So as Africa, we really need to think very hard about how we respond to this. And of course, we have to deal with transport infrastructure and other barriers which are making it difficult for us to have a common market. Thank you.
Thank you. We have just a couple of minutes left. So I saw a question come in here that I thought was quite interesting and quite succinct, that I can throw out to anybody. And that is, what are killer strategies for addressing the emerging economic exclusion during this COVID-19 era? Small, medium enterprises, the poor, generally the informal sector is hit hard. So what are the low-hanging fruit, the killer strategies, the magic bullets, and they could be global or national, for dealing with the substantial poverty and deprivation and pain that's going to be caused, particularly in the developing world, as a consequence of lockdowns and so forth globally?
I'm happy to start off the discussion on that. That's a great question. It's an enormous question, as well as we think about what the solutions are. I think, though, what Western countries have been doing, in particular in creating liquidity and stimulating economies, needs to not end there. And that one of the key factors in thinking about working together globally, particularly in trying to protect people in informal economies in developing countries, it goes to thinking about debt issues. It goes to injecting more liquidity into economies. It goes into supporting governments that are looking to create social safety nets, which I hope will be one silver lining coming out of this global crisis, is the number of governments that are moving more towards such safety nets, cash transfers, and others that would be supporting citizens in need. And before turning it over to colleagues to add to that, I wanted to just add 2 cents to the last question, which you posed about global values and about types of governance. I respectfully disagree with my co-panelist, Mr. Wong, when he said that it's not about political values and it's about science. I don't think that you can completely eliminate the political values issue, which is why when there were first instances in November of last year in Wuhan that there was a disease, I think the political values of the Chinese government felt that that was inconsistent with their narrative. And that's why the doctors who were starting to talk about this were punished for raising it, and why it wasn't originally put out there. You can't separate the values of a government and of what's going on in terms of what actions are taken and what kind of response is delivered.
Professor Wang, would you like to come in there?
First of all, Mr. Harris, I have to my quick response that I think I never said it is not about politics. What I was saying that what we need to do, the lesson we have to learn from this fighting against this pandemic is about to keep a healthy balance between science and politics, because science exists in a vacuum. Politics always looming large in society, in every country, in every country and locality. So science and politics, the relationship between two of that, it is the issue has been debated among scholars, among scientists for a very, very long time. So I never said the politics is never been there. So just look at, so you talk about China. So if we turn to the United States, what happened, right? In the United States, for instance, the government Washington has squandered, months after months of time because it downplay the impact of the pandemic, and for what purpose? Because of political calculations, right? This is so now, and because of the pressure coming out of political campaign, and now they are scapegoating on China. So I think the science, there's a consensus already among the scientific community and also international communities. This is exactly what happened yesterday at the WHO, which is the stigmatization is not the right way to go, because when pandemic happens, it strikes. It's an accident, right? No one wanted to happen, and of course, no public health system is perfect in fighting against the unprecedented pandemic like the COVID-19. And that's why I also agree with you and other panelists in the sense that we have to learn from this, and we have to increase the preparedness of our public health emergence system. And because while we are discussing about the pandemic now, and the scientists already told us, there's high probability of second waves and third waves, future waves of the pandemic coming back, COVID-19 coming back. So we have to really move very rapidly, try to sort of make up the loopholes in our public health emergency system, and how to get ready for the next waves of pandemic that might be coming in the coming months. So I think I also just allow me to respectfully disagree with you. I really don't think highlighting the differences in political values, ideology really helps in any way in finding a solution to fighting against this pandemic. Because when you look at the and also I would argue that it is a wrong-headed way to shape the debate and discussion. Because if you look at all the countries around the world, which ones are who sort of did the, relatively speaking, good job or better job in terms of forging effective responses to the pandemic? Everyone is across political spectrum, right? Of course, China, but also Japan, South Korea, Singapore. They do not necessarily share the same ideology or political system as China does. So I think the key variable here is whether or not when a government is forging in response to the COVID-19 pandemic, it is following science. If politics trumps science, and this is what we see, in some of the countries now. Of course, you will suffer from that. But whenever the science actually, we maintain, we keep or restore a healthy balance between science and politics, and then this is the time when I think we would be able to win the battle. So I think the key takeaway really is not about which ideology is going to have a say, prove that we are the better system and you are not. From the very beginning, when I made my presentation, I sort of think that kind of zero-sum mentality, including in the value domain as well, I think it is probably not helpful. I think that will be my humble opinion in that regard. Thank you.
Professor Wang, we are somewhat over time. I wish we could explore that further, since it is interesting, the question of to what extent ideology shapes the national response. I don't think there was any disagreement with you about the importance of seeing this not as a zero-sum game. I think the real question is to what extent the science dictates the policy, and to what extent the policy depends also on values. And I think that's a very big and interesting question. And as has been pointed out, there's a considerable amount of academic work on it. And indeed, it's something I write about myself. So I will have to stop this, otherwise I'm going to start talking and then we'll be here for another hour. So I'd like to thank all of my panelists. That was a very, very stimulating and interesting discussion. The recording will be available. We'll edit it and put some nice music and so forth. And then it will be available in a few days. And thank you so much for making yourselves available at times that are not entirely convenient, I realize. And next week, our seminar will be on, the title will be Data and Delusion After COVID-19. And we will be looking at exactly this, about science policy, understanding of science, how data is being managed, and how considerations about privacy might come into it, and a number of related things of that nature. And I hope to see a lot of you next week. And thanks again.
The University of Johannesburg, the future reimagined.